there! Welcome to Skin & Key Productions. I'm Crown Gray's Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking the question of, what if Thomas Malthus was right? Now, many people might not necessarily know about Thomas Malthus. We're going to get into that in the video. As always, we're going to give a bit of context. Before doing all of that, don't forget, obviously, we have to hit the like button, obviously share, subscribe as well. We're trying to reach 2,000 subs by Christmas, so help us out with that. But also as well, never mind all of that. The more important thing, with regard to this video, although obviously that stuff's important as well, because obviously man's got to make bread, but the more important thing is that this is going to be the story of how we make bread, right? So, for instance, in the Lord's Prayer, right, there's a bit where it's like, give us this day our daily bread. And to think about that as a statement is quite, for modern people, it doesn't really mean anything, right? Because we get bread, we get like all kinds of things, right? But I want to take us back a little bit, right? I want to take us back 10,000 years ago to 8,000 BC and put yourself in the shoes of one of the people who are there, right? Well, they wouldn't have had shoes, but you know what I mean. So, okay, you're here and you got a spear, and I tell you to go out, hunt some animals, maybe find some berries, maybe pick a bit of fruit, whatever, right? And that's how you and your ancestors and every other human being who's like living on the planet, all 5 million of them, that's how you're basically going to survive, right? So now I want you to think about this, right? So you or someone that you know, right? It could be a male or could be a female, right? We don't know who the first person to do this was, but someone got the seeds for some crops and planted them, right? And then when those seeds grew, they harvested what came from that, right? And eventually people end up making bread and stuff, right? But the thing is, it's a very long process, right? Human beings have been about for about 200,000 years, right? And it's only been in the last 5% of our existence that we discovered agriculture, right? So if you think about it, in that sense, it's like for 95% of our existence, we were just hunter-gatherers, right? So agriculture is pretty much the biggest thing that's ever happened to us as a species. So as we said, 10,000 years ago, people discovered agriculture, and there's 5 million people on the planet, right? Fast forward 5,000 years, and you end up having the invention of the plow, right? So think about that. You've got 5,000 year intervals, right? So the invention of the plow was as close to the invention of agriculture as we are to the invention of the plow, right? So 5,000 years, not much progress. The world's population in that time grew from 5 million to 45 million, which sounds impressive, but think about it, it's 5,000 years and it's only grown by that much, right? So if it's grown by a factor of 9 over those 5,000 years, then by logic, the human population of the world in 2000 should have been about 405 million. Oh wait, hold on, what? It was 6 billion and now it's like 7.5 billion, getting on to 8 billion. What's happened, right? Well, before kind of getting into what actually happened, we're going to talk about a little bit more of this process of like just how rapid this population increase has been over the last a few hundred years. Right, so as we said, in 8,000 BC, there was around 5 million people in the whole of the planet, right? So bear in mind that London has a population of about 8 million, 9 million people. So that kind of gives you an idea of that, right? 3000 BC, 45 million people. Again, there's more people in England at the current time than lived in the entire world at that point. Then fast forward, and now it's 1 AD, right? And there ends up being 188 million people. So again, you fast forward 3,000 years, and there's only 188 million people. Fast forward another 1,000 years, and there's 295 million people, right? Fast forward to 1500, and there's 461 million people. Fast forward again to 1600, and there's 554 million people. Fast forward now to 1700, and there's 603 million people. Now we're going to get to 1800, and for the first time we've almost reached 1 billion people. So it's 989 million people, right? So over this period of about 100 years, it suddenly shot up, right? So before, it was very like slow growth, slow growth. And then all of a sudden, in that space of 100 years, something very radical happened. We'll get onto that in a little bit. So as we said in 1800, there's 989 million people. By the time it gets to 1850, there ends up being 1.26 billion people. Fast forward now to 1900, there's 1.65 billion people. Fast forward now to 1950, and there's 2.5 billion people on the planet, right? Fast forward now to the year 2000, there's 6 billion people. And today, there's roughly about 7.5 billion. By 2030, it's estimated that there'll be about 8 billion people. So what happened during all this time? Why did things suddenly increase, right? Well, all of this seems to kind of fly in the face of a major theory that was about at the time. So around the time when this population started to take off, there was an economist called Thomas Malthus, right? So he was an Anglican cleric, and he lived from 1766 to 1834, right? And he died at the age of 68, and he had 3 children. So you might be like, well, why am I telling you that? I'm telling you it now just so you kind of get a bit of an idea of it later, right? So anyway, so Malthus, he basically had the theory that population grew at a logarithmic rate, right? So it grows exponentially. So basically, the way to think about it is, you end up having 2, then 4, then 8, then 16, then 32, right? However, he thought that food grew at an arithmetical rate. I think that's the right word, but whatever. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4. So basically, what he thought was that what would end up happening is that at some point, the population of the world would get to such a point that it would outstrip the food supply. Then you'd end up having a crisis, right? So basically, at this time, you have to think about, especially rich people, in England at that time, or just rich people in general, they tended to look down on poor people, and they tended to blame their poverty, on their bad behaviour. And one of the things that they blamed on their bad behaviour was that poor people seemed to have a lot more kids, than rich people. So Malthus, as I said, he had 3 children, and the average kind of poor person at this time had 5, 6, 7, maybe 8, maybe even more children, right? So he analogized poor people to rabbits, right? So basically, obviously the saying breeding like rabbits, that's what he basically thought of poor people. So he thought that, right, okay, if the human population continues to grow like this, what's going to end up happening is that these poor people are going to have more and more kids. And obviously we've got one planet, right? And there's only a limited amount of food. So what's going to end up happening is that everyone is going to end up having to fight for this small amount of food. And basically, we're going to get to a point where there's a crisis, where there ends up being famine, there ends up being a lot of turmoil. But eventually, you end up having a situation where, many of these people, maybe millions of these people, are going to die in. And by them dying, just like with rabbit populations, if rabbits in the field and they run out of food, then what ends up happening is that all of them end up kind of suffering, and eventually a lot of them end up dying until you reach the equilibrium again for what that plot of land can sustain in terms of rabbits. And that pressure point that we spoke about was known as the Malthusian trap, right? So he thought that all of humanity was basically heading towards this Malthusian trap. So in 1798, he outlined this theory, and he put it in what was known as an essay for the principle of population. And so this book ended up being very, very influential in terms of how basically people at that time would think. And actually for quite a long time afterwards, it was actually very influential. So people in those days tended to have a very zero-sum attitude when it came to economics. And people even today now, a lot of people who don't understand economics, will have a very zero-sum approach, right? So basically with Malthus, he was basically arguing for protectionism, right? He was arguing for basically it's kind of survival of the fittest, in a way, a kind of social Darwinist view, before Darwin even came up with his theory. So the idea is that, right, there's a pie or a pizza, whichever makes you less hungry, and the idea is that it's there's a fixed pie, and so if I end up taking more slices, then you will end up having less, right? And the same applies for countries as well. So if one country becomes more powerful, then it has to do so at the expense of another, because there's finite resources, right? Now, any understanding of economics will show that that's completely wrong, right? Because in actual fact, it's not a zero-sum game, that if someone becomes richer, if a country becomes richer, it doesn't mean that it has to do so at the expense of another country. As a matter of fact, both people can become better off, and it doesn't cost anyone anything, right? So this is something which Malthus couldn't really see. So for some reason, people said that he was a student of Adam Smith, yeah. But I don't really see how he was, because what Adam Smith, famous economist, the kind of like quote unquote father of economics, right? He basically argued for free trade. So the idea behind free trade is basically remove tariffs, so remove like kind of like taxes on imports, remove the barriers on trade and stuff, right? And then what will happen is that people will choose the best quality stuff at the cheapest price, right? So if that means that I have to get wheat, for instance, from England, or if I have to get from Spain or from Australia or Canada or wherever it is, right? It means that that's where we're going to get from, right? So that doesn't mean that my country is going to be poorer. It means that actually all of us are going to have a better standard of living. So in order to have this kind of mindset, it takes a bit of like outside the box thinking, right? And this is something which a lot of people, especially in those days, were not very capable of doing. So for instance, this is why Thomas Malthus supported the infamous Corn Laws, right? So from 1815 to 1846, they end up being in England, they end up being Corn Laws, right? So these Corn Laws were basically protectionist policies, right? So after the Napoleonic Wars, there was a big concern of like, oh, like if we don't like support British agriculture, then people are going to end up agriculture is going to go out of business, and then it's going to like harm like Britain, because we're going to not be like self-sufficient, and we're going to have to get from foreigners, and what if there's another war, and blah, blah, blah. So out of fear of that, what they did is they artificially inflated the price of corn from the rest of the world. So they put tariffs on it. So this meant that if you were an English person at the time, a British person, wherever you're from, right, it meant that if you were buying things, right, it meant, that you end up having to have two choices. Either you buy a British corn, which is quite expensive and also might not be like a very good quality, or you could basically pay for something which either going to be the same price or more expensive, which is foreign, right? And it might be better quality, and in a normal like market scenario, it might actually be much cheaper. But because the price has been inflated by these extra tariffs, it means that now you're kind of being priced out of buying that, right? You're being discouraged from buying it. Whereas in a free market, right, people will go, right, okay, this stuff from America is much cheaper, it is much better quality, let's go and buy that. And therefore, poor people can afford to buy these things. This is the argument basically for free trade. And, his policies, Malthus's policies, later down the line end up having a huge effect on Ireland, right? So, obviously, you got the potato famine, which took place in 1845, and this really devastated Ireland. Now, the Corn Laws were repealed in 1846, partly because of this famine in Ireland. But a big reason why they end up being a famine in the first place, well, first of all, obviously they end up being the potato fungus, right? The thing is, just because there's a potato fungus, destroyed the potatoes, shouldn't necessarily mean that there's a famine. Famines, in the modern era, famines are always man-made, because we have the means to solve the issue, but we just choose not to, right? So in the case there, right, as a part of a deliberate policy, it was decided not to help the Irish, right? Because of three things. One, the Irish were poor. Two, the Irish were Catholic. And three, the Irish were Irish, right? So obviously the discrimination that the English upper class had in those days was that they disliked all three of those groups. And so they basically saw the famine as a sign from God, as punishment, for these Irish Catholics, right? You're breeding like rabbits, you're having too many people, so God has sent this famine to punish you guys and to set a warning, right, to not produce more kids, right? So the thinking of a lot of people in England at the time was basically, right, if we support people, if we support whether it's the poor in Ireland or whether it's the poor in our own country, right? If we help them, all we're doing is just kicking down the can down the road, and we're making the situation worse. Because if we give these people more help, they're just going to use that and just have more kids, and then it's just going to mean that the food supply is even more stretched. So this was kind of the thinking of Malthus, right? And he actually ended up debating a lot with David Ricardo, who was a famous economist, who was basically a protege of Adam Smith. So he was a free trader, and the two men clashed a lot, right? But the thing is, what you can see from these debates is that Malthus didn't actually understand economics, and he couldn't understand what was happening in the world around him, yeah, which was suddenly like change and was changing the food supply, right? So he saw the increase in population and he couldn't understand what was actually causing it and actually what would be the long-term effects of that. So that's what we're going to get into now. So as we discussed in previous videos, yeah, Friedrich Bastiat was another economist and he came up with the idea of basically the seen versus the unseen, right? So we're very good at seeing, well, what we see, but we're not as good as imagining what else there could be to see. Yeah. So in other words, what we don't see, it's difficult for us to imagine, right? So, for instance, what Thomas Malthus could see at this time was that lots of people were being forced off of their land, yeah, and were having to come to the city and work in factories, and there was grinding misery and poverty and disease and all the rest of it, right? So that's what he could see, and he could see, you know, the population of England had rapidly grown, so it had grown from 5.5 million in 1700, and by 1850 it had increased to 18 million, right? So almost like increasing by like 3 times as much, right? And so for him, he was very worried that this was the future that England was going down, right? Where you're going to end up having more and more people being born, etc., right? And they're going to be overcrowding, there's going to be disease, all these kind of issues. So that's what you could see, but what you couldn't see was that, you know, agricultural innovations, right, had basically exploded during this time. So one of the main things of this, so we have to first of all ask the question of why were people being evicted from their land? Well, people were being evicted from their land because they weren't needed as much on that land. So during this time, like the King of England wanted to raise more revenue, and so what he decided to do was that you're going to end up having, you know, before this, you end up having like commons, right? So within our cities and within like certain bits of our countryside, we still have places known as commons, and you know, you go to them now and they're basically like little parks, right? Now, back in those days, the commons were, well, as it implies, right? So if you had a cow, if you had a horse, you had whatever it was, right? You take it to the commons, and it wasn't owned by anyone, and your cow could just graze wherever, your horse could graze wherever, your sheep could graze wherever, etc., right? So in that kind of situation there, where there's nothing being fenced off, right? It doesn't make sense for someone to go out and plant things, right? Because if you go out and plant things, then a few hours later, a cow could come along and trample on it, or a horse, like when it's when it's actually like grown and stuff, might go and trample on it and like eat it or whatever. So it didn't really make sense to really innovate, right? And it didn't make sense to really focus in on like kind of agricultural innovations. However, during this time, because you end up having this land, you know, the commons being sold off, yeah, like to private landholders, right? These private landholders decided that, right, this is our land now, so what we're going to do is we're going to make it as productive as possible. So we're going to focus on making these land more productive. So we're going to use different farming techniques. We're going to use more fertilization. We're going to use more mechanization, etc., etc. You know, so you end up having like the invention of the seed drill and many other things like this, right? And so as a result of all these different factors as well, right, you end up having the agricultural revolution. And the agricultural revolution end up leading in turn to the industrial revolution, right? So you end up having more mechanized farming as well, and etc., right? So this meant that the same amount of land could produce a lot more food, and therefore you don't need as many workers, and so these people are kind of, to quote like Scrooge, surplus population. Because actually, you know, A Christmas Carol, which like was done by Charles Dickens, you know, the character Ebenezer Scrooge, he's basically a living embodiment of Malthusianism, right? You know, for instance, where he talks about like, oh yeah, yeah, let the poor die and then it will decrease the surplus population. That's what he's basically referring to, right? This is what Malthusianism was in its like rawest sense. It's basically like, oh, just let the poor die. But actually, we don't, you know, they don't need to die, right? Because with these new farming techniques, it meant that, you know, more food was being produced. It freed up people in the countryside, yeah, to then move to the cities. They then worked in factory jobs, and this is something that people always forget as well. Factory jobs pays more than agricultural work, and also as well, agricultural work is hard. It's sun up till sun down, right? In the factory, yeah, you're working for X amount of hours, but people, like very early on into the Industrial Revolution, right? People, if they went to these cities and it was really as bad as we imagine it being, and don't get me wrong, these cities were terrible, the factories were terrible, right? But people are rational, right? And people vote with their feet. So very quickly, if it wasn't a better alternative, people would have left the cities and gone back to the countryside. The fact is that people left the countryside to go to the cities because there was better opportunities for them in the cities. So this is when you're having the Industrial Revolution, and then with that, during this time there's the Scientific Revolution and the revolutions in medicine as well. And so as a result of all these things combined, you end up having a situation where the birth rates are very high, but the death rates start to really come down, right? And you're starting to see this now in the developing world, right? The countries which are opening up to trade, which are industrializing. It's easy to see the sweatshops and the like the overcrowding in the cities and the slums and all this kind of stuff, right? And all the pollution that's happening. But what's not being seen is like, oh yeah, these people are making rational choices and they're choosing to do that because they're going to have a standard of living which is higher and having more opportunities. And also the land that they were working on before is now becoming more productive, right? So just to give an idea of this, England from 1700 to 1850, as we said, went from 5.5 million to 18 million, right? By the time it gets to 1950, there ends up being 50 million people in England, right? Nowadays, if you look at just England, right, in 2021, you've got 56 million people, right? So the population keeps on rising, but if you notice in the last 60 years or so, the population has kind of flattened out a little bit. And also during this time, you have to flip it and also look at life expectancy. So life expectancy in 1700 was just 38 in England, right? By 1850, it was 43. By 1950, it was 69. By 2013, it had risen to 81. So people are living longer, right? They're having less children, right? But the economy is continually growing and the food supply is continually growing. And the number of people who are used in agriculture is diminishing more and more and more. So now like the workload that's in like agriculture is absolutely tiny in comparison to what it was back in those days. And you're seeing the same picture, not just in the developed countries of the world, but you're now seeing it in real time in the developing world. Now what's quite funny is that, even in modern times, you end up having basically people known as neo-Malthusians, right? So especially in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, etc., you end up having all this hysteria that, as the world population is suddenly like expanding, that you're going to end up having famines and millions, if not billions of people going to end up dying. And even today, with certain elements of the environmental movement, right, people without an understanding of economics and about an understanding of agricultural production, they seem to go right, okay, we've got a limited planet and there's only so much food. So now that there's 7.5 billion people, that we're just going to run out of food and just going to be mass starvation and etc., right? Now, the thing is, this kind of misses the point of the progress which we've had, right? So to look at this alternative history view, right, in terms of what if Malthus was right, basically what would have had to happen over the last 200 years at least, right, is for all scientific knowledge, all agricultural innovations or industrial revolutions, medicine, scientific, everything, right, all of that would have had to basically have been stuck where it was in 1750, right? And not just in Europe, but also around the whole world, because even in China, right, people were using the fish entrails, right, and using that as fertilizer, so that instead of one rice crop a year, you end up having two. And so as a result of this, we can see that the population has exploded and it's continued to explode, right? But far from this kind of Malthusian trap where the population keeps rapidly increasing and stuff, what all these people kind of fail to take in consideration is that over time you're having something known as the demographic transition model, right? So in stage one, you're having high birth rate and high death rates, right? In stage two, the death rate plummets, right? But the birth rate stays high. In stage three, you end up having the birth rates coming down. And in stage four, you end up having basically a thing where, if anything, the population is either stagnant or it ends up slowly decreasing, right? And this is a pattern which we're seeing in more developed countries, right? So places like Japan, in places like Eastern Europe, in places like Germany, etc., we're starting to see actually that the population is decreasing, right? And so why is that, right? Because if Malthus was correct, if all these doomsdayers were correct, what we'd expect is that the population, as the economies are growing, people choose to have more kids. People choose to have, like, if the world's GDP is increased by so much, we should be having 20 kids, 30 kids, whatever it is, right? Instead, that's not happening. Instead, the number of people who are having more and more kids is decreasing, and the number of people having maybe 2 children, 3 children, etc., is increasing, right? And that's why I say, like, with Malthus, when he had 3 kids, right? Even today, that's uncommon, right? There's still a lot of people who have 3 children, right? But a lot of people have 2 children. Some people have 1 children. Some people go for life and have 0 children, right? And this is something which he couldn't see, and which a lot of people couldn't see. That as people get richer, actually people choose in general to prioritize having a higher standard of living for themselves, right? So rather than having lots more kids, they end up having fewer kids. Because in a society where, you end up having 8 kids, 2 of them die from disease, one of them dies from a famine, etc., whatever it is, right? It makes sense to have a lot of children, because in old age, right, you need to have that security, right? You need to have your children and grandchildren looking after you. You need to have them working in the fields, all this kind of stuff, right? So in a society where people are comfortable and people don't need to do that, and they have a decent approximation that their children are going to live into adulthood, you don't need that many kids. And so that's why people have tended to have much fewer kids, because kids are really are a handful, and it's very difficult, and so they're choosing to have an easier life rather than having just more and more kids. So the population of the world is steadily increasing, but what people are estimating is that what you're going to end up having by the end of this century, so by 2100, you're probably going to have about 9 billion people. Obviously, some people say it might be 12 billion, etc., etc. But more likely than not, what's going to happen is that the population in the world is going to reach a certain point, and then it's going to start plateauing, right? And this is because as places like India, like Africa, etc., etc., as they increase economically, they're going to have a situation where they are more comfortable, and they don't need to have as many children, and they are going to be better at protecting the environment. They're going to be more regulations, in the same way that we had all these improvements and stuff, right? Our standard of living, these people are basically hundreds of years behind us, so they just need to catch up. So what we can see, for instance, in terms of life expectancy, right? Lesotho, right, which has the lowest life expectancy in the world at the moment, it has a life expectancy of 50 years, right? England in the 1800s, as we kind of said, had a life expectancy of 40 years, right? So you can already see that today, because of these innovations, because of this industrialization, because of this agricultural revolution, right, you're having a situation whereby even the country which has the lowest life expectancy still has a life expectancy which is higher than England, which was the richest country in the world 200 years ago, right? And same thing as well when we look at caloric intake, right? So caloric intake has risen through the roof, in most countries in the world, right? So for instance, the country which has the lowest caloric intake of any country, right, is the Central African Republic, right? So the Central African Republic has a caloric intake which is equal to what England's was back in the 1600s, right? So this gives you an idea of just how much progress has been made, right? So in order for Malthus to be right, it would basically just mean like that the world would have just stayed exactly how it was for the last 250 years. And that's just flies in the face of everything which has happened. You know what, even in the last 60 years, this is a fascinating fact, which like really blew my mind, right? Even in the last 60 years, in terms of the world, right? If you owned the same amount of land in 1961 to today, right? You'd only need to use 30% of that same land, right, to produce the same amount of food. So, in other words, the productivity of our agricultural output, right, has increased by threefold in the space of the last 60 years. So this explains why Africa's population has skyrocketed in the last few decades, right? This is why all these different developing countries, right, their populations are skyrocketing. But at some point, it's going to reach a point at which standard of living is going to continually get higher, but population is going to stabilize, right? And deaths are going to go down, but people are going to have less children. So Malthusian economics, right, thus far has been proven to be wrong. And the only way in which Malthus will ever be proven right is if basically humanity basically stagnates, right? If we stagnate, or if we even go backwards and the population continues to rise, that's where we're going to have a problem. And actually, here's an interesting fact. For every 1 year that a girl is in education, the birth rate on average is decreased by about 5 to 10%. So the more educated that girls are, the less children they end up having. And this is what we can see in Afghanistan, this is what we see in many places around the world, right? Where women have less educational opportunities, where they have less opportunities outside the home. This is where you have in places where you have very high birth rates. But in all other societies, where women have more equality with men, where they have more opportunity, where people are better educated on family planning and on birth control and all these kind of things, right? This is where you're not having a situation where the birth rate stabilized. So if Malthus was correct, the population of our world today would be off by a factor of 10 from what it otherwise would be in this alternative timeline, right? So in many ways, thank God that he was wrong, because humanity in the last 200 years, even during the time when he was alive, has come leaps and bounds, right? And we're going to continue to make leaps and bounds. And also as well, just with regard to the environmental issue, right? Something to note with the environmental issue is that countries where the standard of living is higher, where people are more comfortable, where people are already living in industrialized societies, right? These are the places which tend to care the most about conserving the environment. Because for most places, in India and China and many other places, right, if the choice is between economic prosperity or care for the environment, they will choose economic prosperity. Whereas countries which are more developed, we have more luxury to make those kind of choices. So as counterintuitive as it might be, actually allowing poorer countries to develop at a quicker rate, that will conserve the environment much more than artificially forcing the poorer countries to not develop, right? And actually what the richer countries ought to be doing is investing more in greener technology and being pioneers for that. So that way, by the time that the developing countries end up being able to afford it, it's much cheaper, they're better able to afford it, right? And then that's pretty much how we're going to solve the climate crisis, right? It's not going to be through repressing people kind of in poorer countries and saying no, you can't develop. This is how we're going to do it, right? And it's not going to be through population control. It's not going to be through all these things which the neo-Malthusians have pushing. It's going to be through innovation, just as it has been for the last 200 years. And actually, the only way in which Malthus will ever be proven right is if human ingenuity and human creativity and problem solving, if that comes to a halt and our population, if it continues to rise and people are not given these opportunities, if people aren't this is the only way that this is going to happen, right? So as long as we don't forget the lessons from the last 200 years, we'll do all right, right? So hopefully that's a nice little message to kind of end the video on. I know in the comment section people will be like, no, you're wrong, blah, blah. But just chill out, okay? So I hope that you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button, obviously, and subscribe if you haven't already. As we said, 2,000 subs by Christmas. We can do it, people. I believe in you. Let's do it, right? And the next video is going to be on what if appeasement had continued. So this is looking at basically the 1930s and basically being like, okay, what if the Allies didn't stop Germany from expanding and stuff? What would have been the logical conclusion to that? So anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video and share it with your friends as well. Remember, we said sharing is caring. Also as well, of course, hit us up on Instagram. We've got our merchandise, which is there. If you're interested in merchandise, hit me up as well. And anyway, that being said, have a great day and bye.